What kind of city doesn't collapse, doesn't burn, doesn't explode, but simply goes quiet, as if everyone stood up at the same moment and never came back? In the heart of the Namib Desert, one of the oldest and harshest deserts on Earth, there is a place where doors still hang on their hinges, where beds remain positioned beside windows, where hallways echo with nothing but wind and sand. No warning signs, no ruins reduced to rubble, just a town, intact, slowly being swallowed alive. Its name is Kolmanskop. At first glance, the silence feels unnatural. This is not the silence of decay or destruction. It's the silence of interruption. As if life here was paused mid-breath. The desert doesn't roar. It advances patiently, grain by grain, room by room, year after year. And Kolmanskop lets it happen. Imagine walking through a house where sand has climbed halfway up the walls. Sunlight pours through broken windows, illuminating dunes where dining tables once stood. A child's room filled, not with toys, but with desert. A hospital corridor where footsteps should echo, yet nothing answers back. This isn't abandonment caused by war. There are no bullet holes, no fire scars, no graves marking catastrophe, just absence. And that absence is what makes Kolmanskop disturbing, because cities don't usually die like this. They collapse under violence, famine, invasion, or disaster. Kolmanskop didn't. It was once one of the wealthiest settlements on the African continent, built on a resource so valuable it reshaped global markets. Electricity before nearby capitals, ice shipped across oceans, imported furniture, opera houses, medical technology far ahead of its time. All of it planted in a place where survival itself is a daily negotiation with nature. So the first question isn't how Kolmanskop disappeared. It's why it was ever there in the first place. The Namib Desert is unforgiving. Temperatures swing violently. Sandstorms erase tracks within minutes. Water is scarce. Life resists settlement here. And yet, at the beginning of the 20th century, this hostile expanse became home to a town that looked more like a European resort than an outpost at the edge of the world. That contradiction alone should raise suspicion. Nothing about Kolmanskop was accidental. Its streets were planned. Its buildings engineered, its people carefully selected. This wasn't a frontier town that grew organically. It was designed, controlled, and protected. And when it stopped being useful, it was allowed to fade without resistance. Walking through Kolmanskop today feels like trespassing into a secret that was never meant to be revisited. Wind whistles through empty door frames like breath through ribs. Floors creak beneath layers of sand that erase footsteps as quickly as they're made. You begin to notice how quiet your own presence feels, how small, how temporary. The town doesn't react to you. It doesn't welcome you. It simply waits. That waiting creates unease, because it suggests intention. Why were so many personal belongings left behind? Why did families abandon entire homes instead of dismantling them? Why did no one reclaim what remained? Even in economic collapse, people usually take what they can. Kolmanskop's residents didn't. They vanished, leaving behind a stage set frozen at the moment the actors exited. There are no official signs explaining this to visitors. No plaques detailing urgency or tragedy. The answers aren't written on the walls. They're buried beneath the sand, hidden in decisions made far away from this desert by people who never planned to return. And that's what makes Kolmanskop more than a ghost town. It's evidence. Evidence of how quickly human ambition can overwrite geography. Evidence of how wealth can fabricate life where none should exist. And evidence of how disposable that life becomes when the value underneath it disappears. But to understand why Kolmanskop was abandoned without resistance, without a fight, without even a struggle to remember it, you have to go back to the moment that gave it life. A moment that began not with architecture or settlement, but with something far smaller, something glittering in the sand, before the luxury, before the music, before the hospital beds and chandeliers. There was a discovery so valuable that it justified defying the desert itself. And once that discovery was made, everything that followed was already doomed. If this silence already feels unsettling, take a moment and think about it. A city this rich, this advanced, this carefully built, simply erased by time and sand. Before we go any further, I want to know what you think is really behind Kolmanskop's abandonment. Was it pure economic collapse? A decision made far away by people who never lived here? Or something more sudden, more unsettling? Leave a comment right now with your first instinct. Even a single word is enough. Reading different theories changes the way this story unfolds, and it helps this investigation reach more people who are drawn to real mysteries like this one. If this story is already pulling you in, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. That support is what allows these deep, carefully researched stories to keep coming. Now that you've stepped into the silence of Kolmanskop, we need to go back to the exact moment that created it. It started with something so small it almost feels absurd that it could change the fate of an entire desert. A single stone, barely larger than a fingernail, glistening unnaturally against the dull sand of the Namib. In 1908, this part of what is now Namibia was under German colonial rule, a remote and largely ignored stretch of land where the desert met the Atlantic winds. Railway workers were laying tracks through the sand, pushing steel and timber across a landscape that resisted every attempt at permanence. Among them was a man named Zacharias Lewala, whose job was simple and brutal. Clear stones from the path. One afternoon, Lewala noticed something that didn't belong. The stone didn't look like quartz. It didn't look like ordinary desert rock. It reflected light differently, sharply, almost defiantly, as if the sun itself paused on its surface. Lewala picked it up, unsure of its value but certain of its strangeness, and handed it to his supervisor, August Stauch. Stauch understood immediately. This wasn't just a diamond. It was a signal. Within days, more stones appeared. Not buried deep, not hidden beneath layers of earth. They were lying openly on the sand, as if the desert itself was bleeding wealth. The realization was terrifying in its implications. If diamonds were this abundant, this exposed, then this was not a small deposit. It was something far larger, something capable of reshaping borders, economies, and human behavior. Word traveled fast, but not publicly. The German colonial authorities moved with calculated speed. Entire stretches of desert were declared forbidden zones, Sperrgebiet. Entry without permission became a criminal offense. Armed patrols enforced boundaries in a land that, until then, had barely been governed at all. This was not about safety. It was about control. Diamonds don't just create wealth, they demand secrecy. The companies that followed didn't build slowly. They didn't negotiate with the land. They imposed themselves on it. Infrastructure arrived before people did. Water was piped in. Electricity generators were shipped across oceans. Supplies that made no sense in a desert, ice, furniture, medical equipment, began appearing where survival alone had once been questionable. And then, almost overnight, Kolmanskop was born. But here's the detail that rarely gets discussed. Kolmanskop wasn't designed as a town meant to last. It was engineered as a mechanism. Every street, every building, every rule existed for one purpose: extraction. Diamonds dictated everything. Who could live there? How long they could stay? What they could bring? What they could take when they left? Residents were not pioneers. They were components. The wealth was staggering. Diamonds pulled from this sand flooded European markets. Profits moved across borders faster than the desert wind. The German diamond company didn't just get rich. It gained leverage, influence, insulation from consequence. Kolmanskop became a symbol of modern conquest, not through armies, but through minerals. Yet from the very beginning, the town carried a quiet flaw. Nothing there was sustainable. The water didn't belong to the land. The buildings didn't belong to the climate. The people didn't belong to the desert. Everything was borrowed, temporarily imposed, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. This knowledge created a strange psychological tension. Life in Kolmanskop was luxurious, but fragile. People dressed elegantly while knowing that the sand could, at any moment, reclaim the floor beneath their feet. Children played in homes that existed only as long as diamonds justified their presence. And slowly, almost invisibly, that justification began to weaken. Other diamond fields were discovered elsewhere, richer fields, easier fields, places where extraction cost less and yielded more. The global diamond market shifted, as markets always do, indifferent to the towns built to serve them. The desert didn't change, the people did. What made Kolmanskop possible was the same thing that would make it: disposable. Once the diamonds no longer demanded this location, the logic that sustained the town collapsed, not with an explosion, not with an announcement, but with quiet corporate decisions made far away from the sand. And that raises a disturbing thought. If a city can be created purely by value, what happens to it the moment that value moves on? Because Kolmanskop wasn't abandoned by accident, it was outgrown. And once that process began, everything familiar, comfort, routine, community, became temporary by design. The desert was always patient. It was just waiting for permission to return. Before we move on, I want you to pause and consider this. Do you think Kolmanskop was doomed the moment that first diamond was found? What emerged from the sand at Kolmanskop should not have been possible. In the middle of one of the driest, most hostile deserts on Earth, a city began to take shape that looked as if it had been lifted directly from Europe and dropped into Africa by mistake. Wide streets, elegant houses, decorative facades, verandas designed for cool evenings that did not belong to this climate. Kolmanskop wasn't built to resemble a mining camp. It was built to deny where it was. Inside these buildings, the contradiction became even sharper. Homes were furnished with imported wood, ornate wallpapers, and heavy European furniture shipped across oceans and deserts at enormous cost. There were parlors for conversation, dining rooms set for formality, and bedrooms, arranged with the quiet confidence of permanence. This was not temporary housing. This was an illusion of stability, carefully maintained. Electricity arrived before it reached many nearby cities. A hospital was equipped with cutting-edge medical technology for the time, including one of the first X-ray machines in the Southern Hemisphere. There was a school, a bakery, a butcher, and even an ice factory, producing ice blocks in a place where water itself was a controlled resource. The absurdity of it all was rarely acknowledged, but it was everywhere. Music echoed through the desert. Kolmanskop had a theater where operas and concerts were performed, where violins and pianos filled the night air, while sandstorms gathered just beyond the walls. There was a casino for entertainment, a bowling alley for leisure, and social clubs where residents dressed formally and pretended for a few hours at a time that the desert did not exist. But luxury came with rules. This was not a free town. It was a controlled environment governed by corporate authority and colonial power. Who could live in Kolmanskop was decided by employment, not choice. Movement was monitored. Diamonds were weighed, logged, and guarded obsessively. Workers were searched daily to prevent theft, because here, a single stone could be worth more than a year's salary. The city functioned like a closed system. Everything needed to survive had to be imported, maintained, and protected. Water arrived by rail. Food came from far away. Even the air inside some buildings was regulated to protect equipment and comfort residents. Kolmanskop did not adapt to the desert. It fought it continuously, expensively, and without compromise. That fight shaped the psychology of the people who lived there. Life in Kolmanskop was comfortable, but it was also isolating. Beyond the last row of houses, there was nothing. No neighboring towns, no farmland, no gradual transition from civilization to wilderness. one step beyond the city limits, and the desert took over completely. This created a strange mental divide. Residents lived in refinement during the day, then faced absolute emptiness the moment they looked outward. Children grew up knowing two realities at once. Inside, there was music, education, and routine. Outside, endless sand and silence. Many later described the town as beautiful but unsettling, as if it were floating on something unstable. The comfort felt real, yet fragile, as though it could be withdrawn at any moment. And in truth, it could. Because none of this existed for the people who lived there. It existed for the diamonds. Every investment, every luxury, every architectural decision was justified by the assumption that extraction would continue. As long as diamonds flowed, Kolmanskop would remain untouched by scarcity. The moment they didn't, the logic collapsed. The city had no second purpose, no independent economy, no reason to exist beyond the ground beneath it. What makes this stage of Kolmanskop's story unsettling is not the wealth, but the denial it represented. The buildings were designed to make residents forget where they were. Thick walls muffled the wind, curtains blocked the glare of the sun. Social rituals replaced awareness with routine. For a while it worked, but the desert never stopped pressing in. Fine grains of sand slipped through window frames and door cracks, settling quietly in corners. Sand had to be swept daily, sometimes hourly. Roofs and foundations required constant maintenance. Engineers fought an invisible enemy that never rested. Each day, the effort to preserve normality grew slightly heavier, and beneath the surface, another pressure was building. Kolmanskop's luxury masked a deeper truth. The town was never meant to age. There were no long-term plans for expansion, adaptation, or survival beyond extraction. It was a high-functioning anomaly, sustained by profit and nothing else. The moment that profit began to shift, the illusion would fracture. The people sensed it before it was ever announced. Whispers spread quietly. Contracts shortened. Supplies arrived less frequently. Small services were reduced without explanation. The theater hosted fewer performances. The sense of permanence, so carefully constructed, began to thin. And when that confidence disappeared, the luxury no longer felt protective. It felt hollow. Before we move on, consider this. Would you have stayed in a place like Kolmanskop, knowing that everything around you existed only as long as it was profitable? From the outside, life in Kolmanskop looked like a reward. Well-paid positions, spacious homes, reliable food supplies, medical care that surpassed what most people in the region could ever access. Compared to the brutal conditions of nearby labor camps and frontier settlements, Kolmanskop appeared almost utopian. But comfort in this town came at a price that was rarely spoken about openly. Control. Kolmanskop was not governed, like a normal city. There was no mayor elected by residents, no civic council, no public voice shaping its future. Authority flowed in one direction, downward. The diamond company decided who belonged, who left, and how long anyone stayed. Employment wasn't just work. It was permission to exist inside the city. Every resident was aware of this, even if they never said it out loud. Security defined daily life. Workers were searched routinely at the end of their shifts. Pockets turned inside, out, shoes checked, bodies scanned for hidden stones. It wasn't personal, it was policy. Diamonds made trust irrelevant. The assumption was simple. Anyone could steal, and therefore, everyone had to be monitored. This constant surveillance shaped behavior. People learned to move carefully, to speak cautiously, to keep opinions quiet. Friendships formed, but always within invisible boundaries. Everyone understood that one accusation, one violation of rules, could mean immediate removal. And removal from Kolmanskop was not a transfer. It was exile into the desert economy beyond its gates. The illusion of safety inside the town was powerful, but it was fragile. Residents lived well, yet they were completely dependent. Food arrived on schedules they didn't control. Water flowed because someone else decided it should. Electricity existed because it was profitable to maintain. Nothing was guaranteed by rights. Everything was conditional. That conditional existence created an undercurrent of anxiety. Parents raised children knowing their future in Kolmanskop had an expiration date. Contracts ended, markets shifted, diamonds depleted. There was no retirement here, no generational continuity. Families didn't plan for grandchildren in this town. They planned exits, even while pretending not to. And yet, many stayed longer than logic would suggest. Why? Because privilege can be intoxicating. The contrast between Kolmanskop and the surrounding desert was extreme. Step outside the controlled perimeter, and life became immediately harder, harsher, and uncertain. Inside, there was structure, comfort, and order. That contrast discouraged dissent. People tolerated control because the alternative felt worse. This is how systems maintain themselves. Kolmanskop did not need force to keep people compliant. It offered security in exchange for silence, stability in exchange for obedience, luxury in exchange for autonomy. Over time, residents adapted so completely that the rules faded into the background. Surveillance became routine. Dependency felt normal. But the safety was never real, because the same system that protected residents could abandon them without warning. And slowly, signs began to appear that the balance was shifting. Supplies became inconsistent. Maintenance slowed. The company's presence felt more distant. Decisions affecting daily life were made farther away, by people who had never walked Kolmanskop's streets. And then came the quiet. Realization that control was loosening. Not because residents were gaining freedom, but because the system no longer cared enough to maintain it. The guards were still there. The searches still happened. But something essential was missing. Commitment. Kolmanskop had always been a place of privilege built on extraction. Once extraction slowed, the privilege became a liability. Why invest in comfort for a town whose purpose was ending? Why maintain order when abandonment was cheaper? This is when safety turns into uncertainty. People began to feel it in small ways. Delayed shipments, closed facilities, shortened contracts, conversations lowered in tone. The unspoken question crept into daily life. What happens when they no longer need us here? That question never received a public answer. Instead, people started leaving quietly. Some took transfers, others returned to Europe. Some simply disappeared from the town's population lists without explanation. Houses emptied, streets felt wider. The illusion of control began to crack. And once that illusion breaks, what remains is fear. Because in a place like Kolmanskop, safety was never built into the land. It was rented, and the lease was expiring. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you think people in Kolmanskop stayed because they felt safe, or because they felt trapped? Leave a comment with one word: safe or trapped. At first, it was easy to ignore. A thin layer of sand near the doorway. A corner of a room that needed sweeping more often than usual. A window that no longer sealed perfectly against the wind. In a desert, sand is expected. It's background noise, something you clean, manage, live with. But in Kolmanskop, the sand wasn't just present, it was advancing. The town had been built on the assumption that nature could be controlled indefinitely. Engineers believed walls, foundations, and constant maintenance would be enough. For years, that belief seemed justified. The buildings stood firm. Streets remained visible. Life went on. But the desert doesn't attack quickly. It tests patience. Wind patterns shifted subtly. Storms became more frequent. Fine grains began slipping through gaps that had never mattered before. Sand piled against exterior walls, pressing with quiet persistence. Maintenance crews worked harder, shoveling, reinforcing, repairing. The effort became part of daily routine, then part of the town's identity. What few admitted openly was that the desert was never retreating. Inside homes, sand crept under doors and settled along baseboards. Curtains had to be shaken out daily. Furniture legs disappeared slowly, as if being swallowed. The sound of sweeping became constant, not dramatic, not urgent, just endless, and psychologically exhausting. This wasn't a sudden disaster. It was erosion of confidence. People began to notice how often repairs were needed, how much effort was required just to preserve normalcy. Roofs strained under shifting loads. Wooden floors warped as sand accumulated beneath them. Cracks formed where foundations met ground that refused to stay stable. The desert was reclaiming space without resistance. What made this unsettling was the timing. As environmental pressure increased, corporate commitment decreased. Maintenance budgets tightened. Crews were reduced. Equipment replacements were delayed. What had once been aggressively defended against nature now felt tolerated. Residents noticed the change immediately. Sand no longer triggered rapid response. Piles lingered longer. Entire rooms were closed rather than cleared. Windows boarded instead of repaired. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This place was no longer worth saving. That realization hit harder than any storm. Because Kolmanskop wasn't just fighting the desert, it was losing institutional support. And once that support weakened, the desert became unstoppable. Nature doesn't need permission. It just waits until resistance fades. Some families attempted to adapt. They moved furniture, closed unused rooms, accepted smaller living spaces. Others stopped trying altogether. Why fight sand in a house you might leave next year or next month? The town began shrinking from the inside. Buildings that once hosted gatherings became storage. Storage became abandonment. Sand filled corridors that no one bothered to clear anymore. Streets narrowed as dunes formed between structures. Familiar routes changed shape weekly. Children who once played freely began avoiding certain areas, warned away from collapsing floors and blocked doorways. The town felt less like a place to live and more like a temporary shelter against something vast and inevitable. And the desert responded accordingly. Wind pushed harder into open windows. Storms rearranged entire rooms overnight. What had taken years to build was being undone quietly, grain by grain, without drama or announcement. This was the moment Kolmanskop truly began to die. Not when the diamonds declined. Not when contracts ended. But when the fight stopped. Because once humans stop resisting nature, the outcome is never in question. The desert does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It absorbs. And Kolmanskop, for all its wealth and ambition, had finally become defenseless. Before we move forward, pause and think about this. If you knew your town was slowly being reclaimed by the environment, would you keep fighting? Or would you walk away? From the outside, nothing seemed to change. The guards still stood at the gates. The trains still arrived, though less frequently. Lights still turned on at night. On paper, Kolmanskop was alive. But the real collapse never announced itself inside the town. It happened far away, in offices and boardrooms where Kolmanskop existed only as numbers on a ledger. Diamonds had always been the reason the city existed. Not community, not permanence, profit. And profit, unlike people, has no loyalty. By the early 1920s, the world of diamonds was shifting. Richer deposits were being discovered elsewhere in southern Africa, particularly further south along the coast and inland. These new fields were easier to exploit, cheaper to operate, and far more productive. The same amount of money that barely kept Kolmanskop alive could generate far greater returns somewhere else. To the people living in the town, this information arrived indirectly. Contracts shortened. Bonuses disappeared. Equipment upgrades were postponed. Entire sections of operations were quietly transferred to newer sites. No speeches were made, no explanations given. The Diamond Company did not need to justify its decisions to a town that existed solely at its convenience. This is how empires collapse in modern times, not with explosions, but with reallocations. Kolmanskop had become inefficient. Its isolation made logistics expensive. Water had to be transported long distances. Buildings required constant maintenance against sand and wind. Labor costs were higher than in newer mining areas. Every diamond pulled from Kolmanskop now carried a heavier price tag. From a corporate perspective, the decision was obvious. From a human perspective, it was devastating. Residents sensed the shift long before it was confirmed. Meetings were canceled. Supervisors rotated out and were not replaced. Long-term planning vanished. The future stopped being discussed altogether. When people asked questions, answers were vague, deflected, or postponed. That uncertainty was worse than bad news, because without information, families could not plan. Should children be sent to schools elsewhere? Should homes be packed? Should savings be moved? The silence created paralysis. People waited, hoping stability would return, even as evidence mounted that it wouldn't. And then came the quiet exits. Some workers were reassigned to other mining towns. Others were offered compensation to leave voluntarily. A few were simply informed that their positions were no longer necessary. Each departure reduced the town's rhythm. Fewer footsteps, fewer conversations, fewer lights on at night. Kolmanskop didn't empty all at once. It thinned. Businesses inside the town followed the same pattern. The bakery reduced production. The school merged classes. The hospital closed wings. Entertainment stopped entirely. The theater went dark, not because of disaster, but because there was no audience left to justify performances. This is when the illusion finally collapsed. People realized that Kolmanskop had never been a town in the traditional sense. It was a support structure for extraction. Once extraction moved, the structure was irrelevant. There was no effort to reinvent the city, no attempt to diversify, no plan to preserve it as a settlement. Why would there be? Preservation has value only when someone benefits from it. And by this point, Kolmanskop benefited no one in power. The most unsettling part is how clean the collapse was. No protests, no resistance, no public reckoning, just paperwork, signatures, and silent approvals. Entire lives were erased by administrative decisions made by people who would never feel the desert sand under their shoes. And once those decisions were finalized, the remaining question became painfully simple. Who would leave next? Before we continue, think about this. Do you believe Kolmanskop could have survived if the Diamond Empire had chosen to invest differently? Or was its collapse unavoidable from the moment profit shifted? There was no final announcement, no sirens, no evacuation order, no moment where the town gathered to hear that it was over. Kolmanskop didn't end in a single day. It dissolved. Families left in small waves, quietly, almost politely. A transfer notice here. A contract expiration there. Some departures were planned weeks in advance. Others happened overnight. One house would be lit in the evening and dark forever by morning. Curtains left hanging, doors unlocked. Furniture untouched. And that is the part that still unsettles people today. They didn't take everything with them. In many abandoned towns, desperation strips places bare. Wood is torn out, metal scavenged. Anything valuable disappears first. Kolmanskop didn't experience that kind of collapse. Instead, people left behind pianos, cabinets, books, dishes, hospital equipment, even children's toys. Objects remained exactly where they had been used last. It feels wrong, as if something interrupted the act of leaving. But the truth is more disturbing than a sudden disaster. Most residents believed their absence would be temporary. They expected to return, to collect belongings later, to reclaim homes once things stabilized. The company never told them otherwise. It didn't need to. Time did the work. Weeks became months. Months became years. The desert advanced into empty houses faster than anyone anticipated. Wind sealed doors with sand. Windows collapsed. Floors warped. What could have been recovered became inaccessible, then impossible. The town crossed a threshold. Once enough people left, maintaining basic services no longer made sense. Electricity was shut down section by section. Water deliveries stopped. Medical care ended. The last remaining families realized that staying had become dangerous, not just uncomfortable. With no infrastructure, no protection, and no future, leaving was no longer a choice. It was survival. The final departures were lonely. No farewells, no witnesses. Just footprints leading out of town, erased within hours by the wind. Kolmanskop didn't experience a dramatic final night. It experienced a quiet forgetting. And that forgetting is why so much was left behind. Objects lose meaning when the future disappears. When there is no return planned, no home waiting, possessions become burdens. It is easier to walk away light than to carry reminders of a life that no longer exists. By the time the last residents left, Kolmanskop had already stopped feeling real. It had become a memory that the desert was rapidly overwriting. What followed was inevitable. With no one to resist it, the sand poured in. Entire rooms filled to the ceiling. Staircases vanished. Hallways became dunes. Buildings tilted under uneven pressure. The town's layout distorted until it no longer matched any map. And yet, nothing collapsed completely. That's what makes Kolmanskop eerie rather than ruined. Walls still stand. Roofs still hold. The structures endure, just enough to preserve the feeling of abandonment rather than destruction. It looks as if the people left yesterday, even though decades have passed. This creates a disturbing illusion of presence. Visitors often report feeling watched, not by ghosts, but by absence itself. The town feels paused, not dead, as if the moment of departure never finished. And perhaps, in a way, it didn't, because abandonment on this scale is not an event, it's a process, and Kolmanskop is frozen inside that process, permanently caught between occupation and erasure. Before we move on, consider this carefully. Do you think the people who left Kolmanskop truly believed they would return? Once the last people were gone, Kolmanskop stopped being a town and became a process. The desert did not rush in triumphantly. It didn't tear buildings apart or flatten walls overnight. Instead, it did what it has always done best. It waited, then moved slowly, deliberately, with absolute certainty that no one would stop it. Without footsteps to disturb the sand, dunes began forming inside homes. Wind entered through broken panes and unsealed doors, carrying grains that settled gently at first, then piled higher with every passing season. Beds disappeared beneath drifts. Bathtubs filled like shallow basins. Pianos were buried until only their curved tops remained visible, like fossils of a forgotten culture. Rooms lost their function before they lost their shape. A dining room became a slope. A hallway became a ridge. A staircase became a cascade of sand. What is unsettling about Kolmanskop is not that it collapsed, but that it transformed. The city didn't fall apart. It was absorbed. Architecture became terrain. Human intention dissolved into geography. Sunlight now pours through roof gaps and shattered windows, casting sharp shadows across dunes that were once floors. The silence is broken only by wind, a sound that feels less like weather and more like breath moving through a body that no longer lives. And yet, the town remains recognizable. You can still tell where families slept, where meals were shared, where doctors worked, where children once studied. The desert has not erased these spaces. It has preserved them in a distorted state, frozen between memory and oblivion. This preservation is what makes Kolmanskop haunting rather than tragic. Most abandoned places decay into rubble. Kolmanskop became a museum curated by nature itself. Each room tells two stories at once. What humans built, and how easily it was reclaimed. Over time, wildlife returned. Birds nested in roof beams. Small animals tunneled through sand-filled corridors. The town became part of the desert's ecosystem, no longer an intrusion, but an artifact. But the desert did not forget what Kolmanskop represented. Every storm rearranges the interior slightly. A room that looked one way last year looks different the next. Walls are exposed, then buried again. The city is constantly being rewritten, never settling into a final form. This gives Kolmanskop a strange, unsettling sense of motion, as if it is still changing, still alive in a way. Visitors today often describe a feeling of unease they can't fully explain. It's not fear. It's not sadness. It's the realization that nothing humans build is ever truly permanent, no matter how wealthy or advanced they believe themselves to be. Kolmanskop was once a symbol of domination over nature, electricity over darkness, infrastructure over isolation. Comfort over scarcity, now it stands as the opposite, a reminder that dominance is temporary, and nature only waits for neglect. What makes this even more disturbing is how quickly the transformation happened. Within a few decades, a functioning, wealthy town was rendered uninhabitable, not by catastrophe, but by absence. The desert did not need to destroy Kolmanskop. It only needed humans to leave. And once they did, the city belonged to the sand. Before we continue, think about this. Do you see Kolmanskop as a ruin or as a warning? When a place is abandoned without a clear ending, stories rush in to fill the silence. Kolmanskop did not escape this fate. In fact, the absence of a dramatic final moment made it fertile ground for speculation. With no official closure, no single date marking the end, the town became a blank canvas for rumor, myth, and uneasy questions that still circulate today. Some stories claim the abandonment was faster than records suggest, that certain families, left in a hurry, warned privately of something coming that was never made public. Others speak of sealed documents, of corporate decisions hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, designed to avoid panic while quietly emptying the town. There are whispers of health concerns. The desert environment was harsh, but mining introduced new risks. Fine dust, long-term exposure to harsh conditions, isolation from broader medical infrastructure. Some speculate that illness spread quietly, never acknowledged, openly accelerating departures. No mass graves were found, no official outbreak recorded. But silence leaves room for imagination. Then there are the stories of extreme control. Accounts describe surveillance beyond simple diamond security, strict curfews, limited communication with the outside world, a sense that Kolmanskop was not just protected, but contained, that people were watched not only to prevent theft, but to ensure compliance. When the town began to empty, some believed the same. System that once enforced order simply erased the place from concern. And of course, there are the ghost stories. Visitors report hearing footsteps where no one walks, doors moving without wind, the feeling of being observed in empty rooms, shadows that seem to linger too long in doorways. These stories are common in abandoned places, but Kolmanskop amplifies them because the setting feels unfinished, like a sentence cut short. But the most unsettling question isn't supernatural. It's administrative. Why was Kolmanskop allowed to fade without preservation, recovery, or documentation? Why were buildings left intact instead of dismantled? Why was there no effort to relocate structures, reuse materials, or record the town before it vanished into sand? The answer may be uncomfortable. Kolmanskop had outlived its usefulness. Once the diamonds were gone, the town held no strategic value. Preserving it would have required investment with no return. And history shows that when profit disappears, memory often follows. What remains today is a place suspended between fact and fiction. Some stories are exaggerated, others are partially true. Many will never be confirmed because the people who made the decisions had no reason to leave a record behind. That uncertainty is what keeps Kolmanskop alive in the public imagination, not as a solved mystery, but as an unresolved one. Before we move on, I want to know your instinct. Do you think Kolmanskop still hides secrets that were never meant to be found? Kolmanskop is not just a ghost town. It is a pattern. What happened here has repeated itself across history in different forms, on different continents, under different flags. The names change. The resources change. The outcome rarely does. A valuable discovery appears in an inhospitable place. Capital moves in quickly. Infrastructure rises faster than culture. Comfort is imported. Order is imposed. Life feels stable, not because it is rooted, but because it is funded. And for a time, the illusion holds. Kolmanskop existed because it was profitable to defy geography. The moment that profit shifted elsewhere, the logic that sustained the city collapsed instantly. No moral debate, no attachment to the people who lived there. No concern for the community that had formed. The town was not dismantled because dismantling costs money. It was cheaper to leave it behind and let the desert do the work. That is the most uncomfortable truth Kolmanskop exposes. Human ambition is often temporary, but its consequences are not. The houses, the streets, the objects left behind, they all testify to how confidently people once believed they had conquered this place. Electricity before nearby capitals. Luxury where survival itself was uncertain. A European lifestyle planted into African sand without asking whether it belonged there. Kolmanskop shows what happens when wealth moves faster than wisdom. The town had no roots, no future independent of extraction. No reason to exist once the ground stopped giving. And because of that, it could be erased without resistance. Not destroyed, abandoned, forgotten on purpose. Today, when we look at images of sand-filled bedrooms and buried hallways, it's easy to romanticize the scene, to treat Kolmanskop as a beautiful ruin, a photographer's dream, a symbol of decay. But that framing misses something critical. Kolmanskop is not ancient history. It is modern enough to recognize ourselves in it. Cities today still rise around resources, industries, and speculative value. Entire communities are built on assumptions that markets will always sustain them. When those assumptions fail, people are left behind, just like they were here. Not with explosions, but with silence. The desert didn't kill Kolmanskop. Decisions did. Decisions made far away by people who never intended to stay and never planned for what would happen when they left. The sand simply revealed the truth that was already there. And that is why Kolmanskop continues to unsettle those who walk through it. Not because it is haunted, but because it is honest. It shows in physical form what happens when human systems are designed without permanence, responsibility, or belonging. The city stands half buried as a reminder that wealth can create life, but it cannot guarantee continuity. That ambition can build wonders, but not roots. And that when value disappears, even entire cities can be treated as disposable. So, the final question Kolmanskop leaves us with is not about the past, it's about the future. How many places exist today only because they are still profitable? And how many of them will look just like this once they aren't? If you've stayed with us until the very end, congratulations. You've witnessed the rise, the wealth, and the haunting abandonment of Kolmanskop. Now it's your turn to participate. Leave a comment sharing your theory. Was Kolmanskop doomed from the start, or could it have survived if circumstances were different? Your insight adds a new layer to this story and helps others see the mystery through fresh eyes. Don't forget to hit the like button to show that you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most mysterious ghost towns in the world. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. There are countless other lost cities, forgotten civilizations, and strange disappearances waiting for you. And finally, keep the journey going. Check out the next video, appearing on your screen. It will take you even deeper into the world of deserted towns and the secrets they hide, revealing mysteries that challenge everything you thought you knew. Your engagement helps uncover stories that the sands of time almost buried forever. So comment, like, subscribe, and prepare for the next revelation.